The building had a scent, damp concrete laced with rusted plumbing and the distant memory of kerosene. Rain had fallen earlier that day, the kind that silenced Lagos for hours. Mud traced lazy streaks along the stairwell, and a single bulb flickered overhead as Emeka ascended the steps, his shoes silent against the cracked tiles. He wore a plain white shirt rolled up at the sleeves, and trousers that had once been crisply tailored but now sagged slightly at the knees. The landlord barely glanced at him when he handed over the keys.
"Third floor. Don't disturb anybody,"
he muttered, not out of rudeness but habit. Tenants came and went in that building like the seasons. Unremarkable, transient. Emeka's new apartment was narrow and dim, the kind of place with paint bubbling under years of moisture and walls that whispered every sound. A single window looked out over a cluttered backyard, where broken generators and plastic chairs rusted together in silence. He stood there for a long time just staring. He unpacked slowly, not with the disarray of someone making a temporary stop, but with the precision of a man taking permanent refuge. One suitcase contained nothing but books, worn copies of history, politics, and a leather-bound notebook that appeared to have been soaked once and carefully dried. The second held clothes, mostly neutral tones, with a faded navy tie tucked between folded shirts like a relic from another life. That first night, the building was restless. A baby cried 3 doors down, and an argument erupted from the floor above. Emeka sat cross-legged on the cold tile, sipping water from a plastic cup, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He did not react when a cockroach skittered past. Outside, a power cut plunged the street into darkness, and the familiar symphony of gasoline generators rose like a chant. But his room stayed silent. No light, no generator hum, just stillness. 2 days later, he swept the corridor outside his door. Not because anyone asked him to, but as if wiping away the traces of those who came before. On the 4th day, a neighbor knocked to ask if he had change for 500 Nigerian nairas. Emeka opened the door just enough to pass her a 200 Nigerian nairas note. He said nothing. His eyes didn't match the apartment. Too alert, too careful. Then the first oddity. A girl no older than 10, knocked and asked him for help with a school assignment.
"Someone said you used to be a teacher,"
the girl said, though no one had ever heard Emeka speak. Emeka didn't answer. He just knelt, reviewed the workbook, and pointed to a mistake in pencil. No words. Just a red pen correction. By the end of the week, people started guessing. He walked too upright. He never bargained when buying food. He read newspapers with a pen in hand. He didn't belong, but not in the way of the wealthy. No perfume, no car, no arrogance. It was the kind of difference born of past consequence, of someone who had once been surrounded by rooms with soft carpets and important conversations. Now he chose the hard floor. It wasn't poverty that marked him. It was withdrawal. And it left people wondering, what kind of man chooses to disappear so precisely? The library was a forgotten place. A low building tucked between a bakery and a pharmacy, its peeling green paint barely visible under layers of dust and Lagos grit. Most people passed by it without a second glance. It held the kind of silence that made you think of cobwebs and sleeping moths. Emeka first entered on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was pushing through the thick, humid air. The librarian, an elderly woman with eyes sharpened by boredom and years of budget cuts, barely looked up when he came in. He walked past the counter without a word and stood in front of a half-collapsed shelf in the reference section. For nearly 20 minutes, he remained motionless, studying the misfiled books as if they were puzzles only he could solve. The next day, he returned with a rag and a small tin of polish. By the end of the week, the entire right side of the building smelled faintly of lemon oil and wood. No one had asked him to clean. No one offered him money. Yet he came daily, methodically dusting, reordering the stacks, even fixing the hinges on a cabinet that had refused to close for months. Then the reading list appeared. One morning, the librarian noticed a crisp sheet of paper pinned to the corkboard. Typed in perfect alignment, it was titled "For Curious Young Minds," and listed 10 books, a mix of African literature, political philosophy, and local history. No name, no explanation. Just titles and a small note at the bottom. Ask if you cannot find them. It was Emika's doing. The list wasn't just educational, it was calculated. Challenging but accessible. Subtle. Soon secondary school students began trickling in. Not in groups, but as lone wanderers curious about the man in the corner who never asked questions but always seemed to have answers. One girl brought her assignment on Kwame Nkrumah. Emika pointed her to 3 books, one of which hadn't been touched in over a decade. Another boy asked about the Civil War. Emika's response was to hand him a dog-eared biography of a former general with 3 pages flagged. There were no lectures, no speeches. Just silent direction. The transformation of the library was unspoken. The dusty floor began to gleam. Students returned for second visits. A bulletin board was updated weekly. The librarian herself began to dress neater, as if the building deserved more dignity now. Then came the professor. Dr. Daramola, from the Department of Political Science at the university, was grading papers in the back when she noticed the man in the corner. She'd been coming sporadically for years, but never seen him before. What caught her attention wasn't his posture, nor his silence, but the way he traced a finger under the lines of a French-translated book on post-independence Ghana, as if each sentence demanded inspection. She tried to engage him with a polite nod. He didn't acknowledge her. Later, she left a card on the front desk, a formal invitation to a university symposium. He never responded. But the next day, as she returned to the same spot, she found the card lying beneath a folded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Decolonization and the Forgotten Ideals of Nationalism." A red underline sliced through the final paragraph. No note, just emphasis. She stared at it for a long time. Something about that gesture felt deliberate, like a test had been passed. The whispers began with an old man who came to fix the ceiling fan in the library. He squinted at Emika, standing by the window reading an economic report from 2009, and paused mid-task.
"You resemble someone,"
he muttered to the librarian as he packed up. She barely looked up from her register.
"They all do,"
she said dismissively. But the man didn't let it go. He mentioned a name, Emeka Nwachukwu, a former government policy analyst, a media fixture in the mid-2000s, then one day gone. Vanished without explanation. The librarian said nothing, but the name stuck in her mind like a splinter. It wasn't long before students started Googling. The internet didn't forget. There were old videos, archived debates from national television, op-eds published in The Guardian, photos from international summits. The man on screen was younger, face fuller, voice sharper. But the eyes were the same. Alert, controlled, introspective. Then came the footage. A university student stumbled upon a recorded symposium from the London School of Economics. The room was dimly lit, the video grainy, but there was no mistaking the commanding presence on the panel. He wore a grey suit, speaking with the sort of conviction that silences a room, not through volume but clarity. He spoke of institutional decay, of the ethical burden of policymaking, of the danger of becoming
too refined for the people one claims to serve.
It went viral, not in the manic, meme-fueled way of celebrity scandals, but in quiet corners of academia and Twitter threads led by Nigerian political science majors. "Is this the same man shelving books in Surulere?" one tweet asked, alongside a photo of Emika at the library window, captured from a discreet angle. The story caught fire. Journalists showed up outside the library. One brought a printout of an old newspaper headline, "Nwachukwu resigns, cites loss of purpose in national discourse." Another reporter tried to ambush him outside the corner store, a phone camera in hand. Emika turned his face calmly, adjusted the strap of his bag and walked away. No denial, no explanation, just absence. The narrative filled in its own blanks. Some claimed he had been pushed out for whistleblowing. Others said he had suffered a personal tragedy, a wife lost, a child, or a terminal diagnosis that made him retreat. There were theories about corruption, blackmail, even voluntary exile. But nothing ever stuck. No official records explained his resignation. His bank accounts had gone inactive. Even his national ID was expired. And yet, every morning he returned to the library. There, he behaved as if none of it touched him. He recommended books to teenagers, cleaned the shelves, annotated articles in the margins with red ink. But the librarian began to notice subtle changes. His notes grew more detailed. He started requesting specific policy journals, subscribing to bulletins through prepaid courier. One morning, a book on infrastructure finance appeared on the desk. Not from their collection. Marked on the first page. Don't forget who pays for the silence. Behind the scenes, connections stirred. At the Ministry of Planning, a quiet internal memo began circulating, marked confidential. Subject: unconfirmed whereabouts of Emeka Nwachukwu. Potential strategic asset. The rumor wasn't that he had disappeared. It was that he had been waiting. It arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped through the slit beneath the library door in a thick, cream-colored envelope. The seal on the back was unmistakable, the golden crest of the Federal Ministry of Education. It sat untouched on the desk for nearly 2 hours. The librarian eyed it nervously, afraid to move it, as if the paper might combust at her touch. When Emeka arrived, punctual as ever, he said nothing. He saw the envelope, lifted it with one hand, and walked silently to his usual corner. There, beneath the shadow of a broken ceiling fan, he opened it with the edge of a library card. Inside was a formal letter, typewritten, elegant in tone but unmistakably urgent. The ministry, in the wake of recent education policy failures and mounting public pressure, had formed a new advisory committee. It was to be made up of former technocrats and intellectuals, tasked with reshaping Nigeria's national curriculum. The letter acknowledged that while he had never formally returned to public service, his influence and insight had continued to ripple in academic and civic circles. It was effectively a recall from exile. Emeka read it once, folded it again, tucked it back into the envelope, and resumed reading a 1984 budget analysis. For the next 3 days, he said nothing about the letter. But the librarian noticed small changes. He arrived earlier. He stayed later. His notes became denser, filled with economic terms and marginalia referencing education models in Finland, Singapore, Ghana. Then came the questions. He sent 3 handwritten letters, each delivered by courier to the ministry's headquarters. One was marked Freedom of Action, the second Anonymity, and the third simply Authority of Influence. Each note was brief, surgical in language. First, would his ideas be taken seriously without political dilution? Second, could he contribute without being made a public symbol? Third, would his role have teeth or be ceremonial fluff? The ministry, desperate and cornered, responded affirmatively. Yes, yes, and yes. The third reply arrived with a signature from the minister himself and a clause added in pen. Your discretion will be protected at all costs. Emeka accepted. Quietly. He declined all official ceremonies, refused a formal title, insisted his name not appear in media briefings or government documents. From that point on, internal communications referred to him only by his initials. Yen. He was not seated at round tables but received transcripts. He did not attend briefings but submitted annotated drafts. His fingerprints began to shape policy from behind the scenes. By month's end, a strange pattern emerged. A policy recommendation he had made, a minor clause about language inclusion in rural education, was adopted word for word by the committee. A few weeks later, a report published by the ministry mirrored phrases from one of his long-ago essays, once archived and forgotten. His fingerprints were everywhere, yet his presence was nowhere. Students at the library noticed the shift. Emeka now arrived in freshly pressed shirts, still modest but deliberate. He carried a different notebook, new leather-bound with colored tabs. He still answered their questions, still swept the shelves. But his gaze now lingered longer on the window, as if watching something far beyond the street. Once, the librarian found him standing before the mirror in the staff bathroom. He was adjusting his collar with slow, precise fingers. She had never seen him look at himself before.
Are you going somewhere?
She asked. He didn't respond. But for a brief moment, his reflection broke into a faint smile, one not of joy but of recognition. As if he'd finally remembered who he had once been. It began with absence. On a morning like any other, the librarian arrived to unlock the library doors, only to find Emika's usual corner empty. His chair was neatly pushed in. The worn copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed he had been annotating the day before was closed, a pen laid across the top as if marking the end of a conversation. First, no one thought much of it. Perhaps he had an errand or fallen ill. But by the third day, students noticed. The boy who always asked about colonial history lingered awkwardly by the desk. A girl brought a notepad and left without opening it. Even the librarian found herself glancing at the door each time it creaked. Then the envelope appeared. It was addressed to the library, marked simply,
To whom it may concern.
Inside was a brief letter in Emika's handwriting.
Knowledge is not a crown, but a tool. Use it to build, not to elevate. I will not be far, but I must be elsewhere. E.
Beneath the letter was a bank receipt, a generous donation to the library, enough to replace their decades-old catalog system and stock the shelves for years. He had left without fanfare as he had arrived. No one knew exactly where he went, but stories filtered in from unlikely places. A school principal in Kogi mentioned a soft-spoken man who had helped design a new civic education syllabus. A teacher in Bauchi said a mysterious consultant had reviewed her staff's curriculum, suggesting dozens of structural improvements in a single afternoon. He never gave his full name. But he carried a blue notebook, used red ink, and always left behind a single line in writing.
Refinement is not retreat, it is precision.
Some believed he was still under government contract, operating in the shadows to influence critical reforms. Others whispered that he had grown disillusioned again, retreating deeper into the margins, unable to reconcile his ideals with the realities of bureaucracy. But evidence suggested otherwise. Behind the scenes in Abuja, policies shifted. Curriculums became clearer, more inclusive. Literacy campaigns were launched with slogans borrowed from his writings. Even ministers began referring to anonymous memos that seemed to preempt problems before they emerged. He no longer needed titles. His thoughts had become architecture, embedded, invisible, foundational. Years later, a civil servant cleaning out an archive room came across a file labeled Nwachukwu E.
Nwachukwu E.
Inside was a single sheet of paper with no date, no letterhead. Typed in clean black ink were the words,
Influence is not measured by applause, but by how long silence echoes after you leave.
And across the bottom, barely visible in pencil, was a line someone had once told a university crowd in London.
We must never become too refined for the people we claim to serve.